Hello, I'm Andy Agavangelo. I'm very proud to be the founder of campaign group Transparency Task Force. As the name suggests, we are heavily into the idea that transparency helps. We believe that the financial sector is profoundly important to the well-being of society, to economic stability, and to political stability too. The idea of transparency, using its powers to take things out of the shadows into the daylight, is not a new one. We can go all the way back to 1914, a wonderful book all about banking misconduct and how the banks use other people's money. And that book gave us the phrase, sunlight is the best disinfectant. And that concept, sunlight is the best disinfectant, is the mantra, if you like, that we have built our international campaigning organization around. All we want is transparency. If we've got transparency, then everything else we want will follow from it. And we're always very, very suspicious when people try to cover things up and keep things in the shadows. It naturally makes us wonder why. So that's kind of what Transparency Task Force is all about. And I mention that because we've got folks here today, who've not been with us before. In the UK, we are classed as a certified social enterprise. We operate as a not-for-profit, and it's probably also worth us mentioning that we run an all-party parliamentary group. I'll provide a link to that in the chat in a little while. Unfortunately, for those of us in the UK, we have to live with the harsh reality that the United Kingdom is something of a hub or a centre for illicit money flows. We've run many events about that issue over the years, and perhaps some of it's to do with our history, having been once upon a time an empire with lots and lots of overseas jurisdictions that are rather good at hiding money and other things as well. Perhaps that's part of the reason why the UK is so good, in inverted commas, at dealing with dirty money. That topic of dirty money is very important, especially when it's seen to be influencing institutions and our politics and our democracy. So when our head of events, Alexandra Zitkus, came across the book by Mr. Gareth Gore about Opus, all about dark money, a secretive cult, and its mission to remake our world, we immediately thought, there's a guy we've got to reach out to. We reached out to Gareth, and he very kindly let us persuade him to come along and tell us all a bit about his book. I hope that sets the scene, folks. Please show your appreciation to Gareth. Thank you very much indeed, Gareth, for being with us. I'm now going to pass over to you to tell us what you'd like to about your book, and then I'll facilitate a Q&A and a discussion after that. Gareth, over to you, sir. Thank you very much.
Sure. Well, first of all, Andy, thank you for inviting me, and thank you to Alex as well for organizing this. The plan is I'm going to talk for 15, 20 minutes to maybe just kind of talk through the story of how I got to write this book and how I fell into this story. And then I'm very open to answering whatever questions you might have in the time that remains. There may be a hard cutoff at 7 because my kids are are already up in arms that they're going to be having their dinner an hour later than usual. Like, Dad, you've got something on, but so there may well be knocks at the door at some stage saying asking where dinner is, but hopefully I can hold them off at bay until then. So I've got a bit of a presentation that I hope I can make this work. Yes, okay. So I mean, you talked about finance earlier, and I'm a financial journalist. I'm not a religious writer, and I very much fell into this story completely by accident. So it all begins in Spain in 2017, in June 2017, when Banco Popular, which was one of the country's largest banks, suddenly collapsed overnight. And at that point, I'd been basically reporting on the rolling European banking crisis for the best part of a decade, ever since the global financial crisis. I've been sent all over the world to, well, all across Europe, in fact, to, places like Greece, Germany, France, Italy, to report on what seemed like kind of the rolling banking collapses. And so when I arrived in Spain in 2017, it kind of seemed like the same old story. It seemed like, this was yet another story of, yet another case of bank executives taking on too many risks and basically letting things spiral out of control before they got a handle on things. And that was the story that I wrote at the time. And that was the story that everybody else wrote as well. But what became clear a couple of years later was that I and everyone else completely missed what the real story was here. Now, completely by accident, 2 years later, I found myself back in Madrid. My partner, who's an academic, had a sabbatical, and we decided to take the kids to live in Madrid for 6 months while she did some research. So completely accidentally back in Madrid. And when I was there, I kind of was hunting around for some stories to report on. And I found out that this bank collapse, which had happened 2 years earlier, was still kind of dragging on in the courts. A bunch of former shareholders who'd lost everything in the collapse, and a bunch of bondholders had decided to basically kind of take the case to the courts to try and fight to get some of their money back. So I, as a financial reporter, reached out to many of the affected parties and asked them to talk to kind of I wanted to hear their side of the story. And all of them, or almost all of them, were very happy to talk. They wanted some coverage of their plight in the international press and in the financial press. But missing from all these conversations was the biggest shareholder of all. So this shareholder that, when the bank collapsed, owned a stake of about 10%. Now, at its height, this stake was worth about 2 billion euros. And this group called itself the Syndicate, which was already kind of mysterious sounding. And them not wanting to talk to me kind of rang a bunch of alarm bells in my head. If someone doesn't want to talk to you as a journalist, then that's kind of suspicious. So I started to kind of dive a little bit deeper into what this organization was. And there were even more alarm bells. So as I kind of unpacked what this group, the syndicate, was, I found out that it was made up of a bunch of foundations which seemingly had nothing at all to do with each other. But when you kind of look beneath the surface, there were kind of very interesting parallels. Like, many of them were registered at the same address. Many of them were headed up by this what seemed like a kind of rotating board of directors that moved from one foundation to the next. And many of them also directed their money to kind of educational programs in various parts of the world. So I thought, this is potentially interesting. You can switch to the next slide if you like. So I managed to track down, um, well, the bank for many years had been run by these two brothers called the Vals brothers. On the left, Luis Vals Taberner, who was a devout Catholic, a member of this group called Opus Dei, and his brother Javier, who wasn't a member of Opus Dei and was very much the opposite of his brother. He was known as a bon vivant in the Madrid kind of banking world. He liked to play golf, he liked a good party, he liked to drink. Inside the bank, they were known rather kind of jokingly as Opus Dei and Opus Night. And unfortunately, Luis had died many years earlier, but Javier was still around. He'd left the bank in, I think it was 2004, but when I approached him in 2019, he was very happy to talk. And my first question was, what the hell is the syndicate? What is this grouping? And he told me straight out. He was like, basically it's a front for Opus Dei. It's a way, for years, this Catholic group has basically controlled the bank. He told me the story of how they had hijacked their way into the bank in the 1950s and basically used the bank as a cash machine for close to 60 years to finance its expansion to every part of the world. Um, I would later kind of piece together the finances and figure out that they'd siphoned hundreds of millions of dollars from the bank, mostly legally, but they'd basically infiltrated the bank, had um, taken control of the board, and put basically kind of people who were sympathetic to their cause on the board, and used that influence on the board to ensure that the bank made enormous donations to Opus Dei projects and to basically kind of accumulate a large position of shares that in the end was controlled by this grouping called the syndicate. Um, so um, so then it became clear to me that there was a much bigger story here. So the story I initially reported about the bank collapse, that maybe there was something more interesting. So I suddenly was on alert for anything to do with Opus Dei, and I needed to get up to speed with what Opus Dei was. Next slide, please. Um, So, you know,
Just to say, Gareth, I love the way you're telling the story. You've got me absolutely gripped, and probably others as well. Carry on. I can't wait to hear
okay.
more.
And yes, and look, I mean, I'm happy to answer any questions about the presentation as you know at the end. The so being on alert for anything to do with Opus Dei, during the course of my investigation, I came across this story in the Associated Press about these women in Argentina, this group of 43 women in Argentina, who alleged that basically Opus Dei had enslaved them as young girls and forced them to work as unpaid labor to cook and clean for its elite members in Argentina. Now, initially, I thought this had nothing at all to do with the bank and the kind of financial story that I was reporting out. But then one day in the archives, I came across this document which was hidden under, it was kind of, it hadn't been filed away properly, and it was hidden in this pile of kind of random documents. But it basically showed how money from the bank had financed the school where these guys had been recruited. You can go to the next slide. So these women had been recruited as young girls, and this is where we can start talking about transparency and opacity. Um, what had happened was Opus Dei had set up this what they called a hospitality school in Buenos Aires, and they'd then gone out to underprivileged communities all around the country to recruit girls to its cause. And they told the parents and told the girls that, look, we've got this great new school in the big city. Your girls here have no prospects. If they really want a better life, send them away with us. We'll take them to this school in the big city. We'll train them. We'll get them to get qualifications. They'll get a chance of a better life. Now, what happened was, once these girls were taken away and they were just aged like 12, 13 years old, once they were hundreds of miles away from their parents, cut off from their support networks, that's when Opus Dei would really kind of set about coercing them into joining the group as unpaid, what they would later become unpaid slaves. Um, they would offer them these false promises, and they're operating under the guise of, we're a bona fide kind of Catholic organization. You have nothing to worry about. When they went out recruiting door to door, they would often have priests with them. Make no mistake, this was a way of recruiting slaves, basically for the organization and for its elite members. Um, Next slide. Um, Now, federal prosecutors in Argentina would investigate the claims of these women and would later conclude that they were indeed coerced into joining Opus Dei. There's a live human trafficking trial that's about to take place in Buenos Aires. So four Opus Dei priests will be standing trial. And actually, the deputy head of Opus Dei globally as well will be standing trial in when this case finally kind of hits the court. But yeah, I mean, the federal prosecutors in Argentina, they conducted a 2-year investigation into what happened there, and they concluded that there were crimes were committed and that Opus Dei and these priests need to answer the cause. So, this is um, basically how I started writing the book. What began as the collapse of a bank in Spain, and me just kind of thinking, just a minute, there are certain pieces of this that just don't really kind of make any sense. Why is the biggest shareholder not talking to me? And then, this seemingly unrelated case in Argentina, I put all of this together and realized that basically what I'd uncovered was this real life conspiracy. The bank had been the kind of financial heart of this network that spanned all around the world. And what had happened in Argentina was happening in other parts of the world as well. So since the news of the Argentina case has hit the media, other women have come forward in other countries, Mexico, Ireland, France, places in Africa and Asia as well, where Opus Dei set up very similar centers. And again, the bank was at the heart of this. Money from the bank was used to set up these schools, to recruit these unsuspecting girls into this life of servitude. Next slide. So what is Opus Dei? So Opus Dei was founded by a Spanish priest called José María Escrivá um, in the late 1920s. So he told his followers that God had spoken to him. God had given him this vision for a new Catholic group that would be set up to allow ordinary Catholics to kind of go deeper into their faith. So the idea was, I guess, before Opus Dei came along, if you were a really serious Catholic and wanted to kind of devote your life to God, the only way to really do that was to either become a priest or a nun. Um, his idea was that basically you could remain a lay Catholic. You could stay in your job as a teacher or a lawyer or a journalist or whatever it might be, and by joining Opus Dei, they would teach you how to be a saint whilst remaining a kind of a lay Catholic. Um, so, but all along, this was just a front for Escriva's political agenda. So he basically kind of, it's kind of interesting that the time that Opus Dei was created was a very tumultuous time in Spanish history. This was, the years running up to the Spanish Civil War, a society deeply divided. The workers had basically risen up, voted out the government. They elected this new socialist government, which kind of kicked out the monarchy, was overhauling Spanish society, pushing, the church away, the influence of the church away, was secularizing things like education, was pushing through laws to enhance the rights that workers had. Escrivá, this priest, saw what was happening around him and was absolutely horrified. And so, you know, he says that he received this vision from God, but also I think, what this group that he created was in reaction to what he saw happening around him. Priests were being targeted, the church was seen as this kind of great evil, and so he saw himself as this great defender of traditional Catholic values. He was, Opus Dei was a reactionary political force right from the beginning. He saw his followers as part of this hidden army, and these are his words, this hidden army that would infiltrate every part of society and use their influence in society to basically kind of, wind back the clock on this progressive agenda. Next slide. Um, but he was never really upfront about the political aims of the group. There was always this kind of spiritual veneer that he put on it. And so, even when he was going out recruiting, he never did it openly. He would basically identify people that he thought would be useful to the movement and he would groom them. Many of these were young men at the time. He would later move on to he would later expand membership to women and later go on to target children. But he basically drew up this secret playbook for how to recruit members. And he specifically told his recruits to go out there and target people in a specific way. He told people that were being recruited not to tell their families that they were thinking about joining Opus Dei. And then once they were in, he would cut them off from their families and friends. He would control any communication they had with the outside world. This organization was all about it was all about controlling its members spiritually, emotionally, psychologically, and even physically. And part of that was this kind of these acts of corporal mortification that he introduced, in which he made compulsory for his members. One of the things that an Opus Dei member is expected to do is were this thing called the Silis for 2 hours every day. It's kind of a barbed kind of wire that you wear around your thigh. It's meant to remind you of the suffering of Christ. Next slide. The other thing is this thing called a discipline. Once a week, you're expected to kind of whip yourself over your back. And, many people draw blood. Again, it's meant to remind you of the suffering of Christ, but it's all part of this kind of meticulously planned life. And it's a way of controlling people and, I guess, um, subjugating, I guess, them to the Opus Dei's expectations. Um, Next slide. So Opus Dei really took off in the years after the Civil War, thanks to its coziness with General Franco, who showered the group with money and resources and opportunities to grow. Despite being supposedly this Christian organization, Escrivá, the founder of Opus Dei, had absolutely no qualms whatsoever about cozying up to Franco, who was a brutal dictator who, even in peacetime, even after the war, murdered tens of thousands of his political opponents and who rounded up, hundreds of thousands of people and put them into concentration camps. This was a man who sent off, left-leaning political activists. He sent them off to Nazi scientists to be experimented on. Escrivá was very happy to deal with this guy. He hosted private retreats for Franco and his wife. Um, Next slide. And and thanks to it really took off in the Franco years. But all along, Escrivá had political ambitions. He knew that in order to really have an influence on society, and that's what Opus Dei wanted to do. It wanted to really, be at the heart of society, be shaping society. He knew that they really needed to be part of the elite. And so from the early days, he very much targeted anyone who, he targeted the rich and the powerful. And he also set up on the top university campuses. The idea was that as well as recruiting today's elite, they would also groom tomorrow's elite. And so, and this is the playbook today as well. I mean, Opus Dei is present on university campuses all around the world. It's primary kind of recruitment ground, and it's because they want to recruit tomorrow's ministers of state, tomorrow's business leaders, tomorrow's authors and journalists, um, and because they know that's the way that they will shape society. Next slide. The Escrivá also made huge efforts to cultivate power within the Vatican as well. Um, in the early 1970s, they set up this organization which was basically a honey trap to try to entice influential figures in the Vatican into Opus Dei's orbit. They very successfully targeted John Paul II before he was Pope, when he was still an archbishop, when he was the Archbishop of Krakow. They successfully kind of brought him into the Opus Dei orbit. They sponsored him at conferences. They published his speeches in little books and distributed them. The whole idea was, let's bring anyone that has any, like they were doing in wider society in the Vatican. They just wanted to bring in anyone who might be in a position of influence later on to bring them into the Opus Dei orbit and to basically make them into a friend. And that really paid off massively because when John Paul II eventually became Pope, he turned to Opus Dei almost as his kind of as his Green Berets. I mean, when John Paul II took over in the late 70s, the church was pretty much divided. There were a lot of very vocal, progressive bishops, archbishops, priests who called John Paul II out for his conservative agenda and the way that he was cozying up to Reagan and many right-wing dictators in Latin America. And John Paul II turned to Opus Dei as a kind of as a counterweight to them. So he gave them a special status within the church. He made them into this thing called a personal prelature. So they were the only grouping within the Catholic Church that was answerable only to the Pope. They no longer had to report to the local archbishop. They could be dispatched to anywhere in the world, and didn't have to answer to the local hierarchy. They were answerable only to John Paul II. And that was very good for JP2 because, at a time when there were lots of people complaining about the way that he was taking, where he was taking the church and his conservative leanings, he had this group that he could dispatch to problematic parts of the world, and he knew that they would be loyal and they would report directly back up to him. It was a way of, I guess, subverting the traditional hierarchy of the church. Next slide. And you know, the two groups were so friendly. Opus Dei and JP2 were so friendly that John Paul II, once Escrivá died, decided to fast track the beatification and then the canonization of the Opus Dei founder. So today, the founder of Opus Dei is a saint in the Catholic Church. He's known as the saint of ordinary life. And what that did was really solidify Opus Dei standing amongst ordinary Catholics. Not only was this an officially sanctioned group within the church, but its founder was a saint. And so, that made recruitment all the more easier. So when Opus Dei was going out there to recruit people, whether it was in the political world in the UK or Spain or whatever, or whether they were recruiting students on campus, you know, they they were legitimized. They'd been legitimized by John Paul II and by the wider Catholic Church. It made that recruitment, even if the recruitment was surreptitious, it made it kind of, so much more effective and so much easier to pull people into its orbit. Next slide. Um, you know, Here's a picture of Escrivá, literally built into the walls of the Vatican, a statue of Escrivá built into the walls of the Vatican. I think that's kind of very symbolic for the standing of this group inside the church these days. Next slide. Now, in the 1980s and 1990s, thanks to its kind of elevated status and the personal approval of John Paul II, Opus Dei made a huge effort to infiltrate the political world in the United States. It had very successfully infiltrated Spanish society, Italian society, and a number of countries in Latin America. But up until the 1980s, it hadn't really kind of made huge inroads into the United States. Now, in the 1990s, especially, the priest on the left here got an Opus Dei priest called C. John McCloskey. He he very, very successfully recruited a number of the Republican Washington Catholic and non-Catholic elite to Opus Dei. He was known in Washington as the convert maker, and he successfully recruited a number of, you know, senior figures in the Republican elite. People like Newt Gingrich, Sam Brownback, Larry Kudlow, Robert Novak, Bill Barr were all recruited into Opus Dei by this guy. He was super. He would later, he would later have to step down amid a huge sexual abuse scandal, and the victim of the sexual abuse scandal was paid $1 million to go off and shut up and not tell anyone about it. But whilst before that scandal hit, he was extremely successful in recruiting the kind of creme de la creme of the Washington Republican elite. And I think it's quite telling as well. In the US, there are about 3,000 members of Opus Dei. Now, you'd expect most of those members to be concentrated in predominantly Catholic cities like New York, Chicago, Boston, Miami these days, I guess, because of the large Hispanic Catholic population. But in fact, the largest Opus Dei community is in Washington, D.C. 800 out of the 3,000 Opus Dei members live in the kind of wider DC area. And I think that tells you all you need to know about how Opus Dei has concentrated its recruitment efforts. This organization, you can't go onto the Opus Dei website and say you want to join. There's no form you can fill in or whatever. It's by invitation only. So Opus Dei basically decides who it wants to recruit, who will be useful for the movement and its political ambitions, and it goes after them and recruits them. Next slide. Now, one of the people most closely allied to Opus Dei in the United States is Leonard Leo, who is former vice chairman or vice president of the Federalist Society, and the man who has almost single-handedly orchestrated the kind of conservative takeover of the US Supreme Court. I think it's five out of the current nine justices are Catholic, and all five of them were chosen by Leonard Leo, handpicked by him, and given to various Republican presidents for approval. Um, um, he's a huge donor to Opus Dei. He is a director at the Opus Dei Center in Central Washington, this place called the Catholic Information Center. And, I think for me, that's the hub of Opus Dei's influence in the United States is this kind of small center on K Street. Next slide. Um, I realize I'm kind of going on here, and I'll try to speed up. I think it's just two more
No,
slides.
no,
I'll try to
in
speed up.
all honesty, this is so interesting. Don't rush, Gareth. This is great. We're good for time.
Um,
Don't rush. Thank you.
so, whilst it's had a huge amount of success in recruiting and in infiltrating kind of civic society, um, the Vatican hasn't been unaware of the abuses that have taken place inside of Opus Dei. As I said before, this is an organization that I think abuses people's spirituality in order to kind of draw them into its clutches, and which uses things like confession, which abuses, I should say, things like confession and things like spiritual direction to kind of gently push people into doing things that might serve the interests of Opus Dei. So, the kind of the modus operandi is very much, they go after you, they recruit you, and it's all kind of smiles. Oh, we just want to help you to become a better Catholic. But once you're in, you know, you're expected to attend regular meetings at the Opus Dei. You're basically allocated a minder who takes over your spiritual journey, and you're expected to tell your minder everything. Even more than what you would say in confession. You're expected to share details of um, your financial life, your sex life, your personal life, and your spiritual guidance counselor takes this information and kind of relays up the chain. There are files collected on all of the members, and the higher ups decide what to do with this information, and they pass back down through the chain. Um, you know, they're not quite orders, but the suggestions for how members should act and how they should use the influence that they might have in their job, or whatever status they might have to further the agenda of Opus Dei. So the Vatican hasn't been unaware of these abuses, and in fact Pope Francis in 2022 made a decision to basically rein in Opus Dei. This was at the same time as the scandal was emerging in Argentina. He, of course, was Argentinian himself. I think, after years of basically turning a blind eye to what Opus Dei was doing, I think Pope Francis felt the time had come to act. And so he ordered the movement to rip up its statutes and start afresh. The idea was, here's your last chance to basically kind of reform from within. For 2 years, 3 years, in fact, the group just dragged its feet. It didn't want to reform. It was playing the long game. It was basically betting that Pope Francis would die, would pass away before he was able to push through any real reform. And when Pope Francis when he passed away last April, it looked like that strategy had really paid off. There were huge efforts just before the conclave to try to ensure that the next pope would be, they pulled out all the stops basically to try and ensure that the next pope would be someone that would be amenable to Opus Dei and maybe would put an end to these reform efforts. Next slide. But then of course, this guy was elected. And, I think expectations were very high that Pope Leo would follow in the footsteps of Francis. He'd been outspoken about people like J.D. Vance, and had um, during his time in Peru had really kind of I guess come into conflict with Opus Dei and marked himself out as a reformer, someone who was willing to take on similarly abusive groups like the Sodality of Christian Life, that was another abusive group in Peru. Pope Leo was at the heart of efforts to really rein in that group and eventually dissolve it. I think expectations were very high, including from myself. Next slide. And actually, one of his very first audiences as Pope, he asked the Opus Dei leadership to come in and explain why they'd been dragging their feet and why reforms had taken so long. That was last May. Now in January, 8 months on, we're still waiting for Pope Leo to take any kind of action. I'm kind of skeptical about what's going to happen. I think that Leo is a reformer at heart. He knows what he should do. But I think, he's also come to the realization that and I think this is what happens so often, in the world of transparency and reform, is that people realize that there's a conflict here, that there are vested interests. So I think Pope Leo would like to rein in this group and would like to do something about them, but I think he recognizes that a real investigation into the abuses and influence of Opus Dei would be a very uncomfortable thing for the church to do. There are likely many thousands of victims of Opus Dei, people like the women who were enslaved, and he could well open the church up to huge financial compensation claims. I think he's very conscious of what happened in the early 2000s when, what started as a very small number of abuse claims in Boston very quickly kind of spiraled into this enormous wave of scandal, which, one meant a lot of people turned their backs on the church because they were horrified about what had happened and how the church was handling it. But then, as a result of those abuse claims as well, many dioceses in the US especially were ended up having to file for bankruptcy because of the sheer weight of the financial claims against them. I think Pope Leo is quite conscious of what happened then, and he doesn't want to open the church up to enormous financial claims again. So I think, whilst I'm hopeful he might do something, and there are indications something will happen, I don't think he will really do a thorough investigation of what's happened here and the abuses that this organization has kind of, yeah, and what it's done over the years. So that basically concludes my long-winded um, presentation. I realize I've now gone up probably massively over the time, the 20 minutes I said, but I'm
No,
very open to answering
it's
anyone's questions.
thank you very much indeed. In all honesty, Gareth, that was so interesting. I and hopefully others followed you all the way through that, and I was listening very attentively to every word you said. There is so much to talk about here. Thank you, Gareth, very, very much indeed. I want to make a couple of points first of all before I get into some questions of my own, and then we'll invite others to chip into this conversation. Transparency Task Force as an organisation is focused on financial matters. We have no view or interest in religiosity or spirituality or things like that. It's not our domain. But what I'm absolutely fascinated by is the workings of our democracy and the workings of how our democratic parties are funded. And what I kind of see here is a Venn diagram, two overlapping circles. The circle representing all the things you've just spoken about, which are obviously of great interest to you, and well done for writing that book. And what a wonderful piece of investigative journalism to get to the bottom of it. That's fabulous. The other circle is a circle which is, if you like, the normal scope of interest of Transparency Task Force. And whilst, of course, much of that is about how is our financial system working, within that question, how is our financial system working, there's often a tension between the interest of big business and the interest of the ordinary person as far as the financial sector is concerned. And very long story short, after 10 years of doing this kind of campaigning, I've come to the conclusion, rightly or wrongly, it's just opinion, that our democracies around the world aren't nearly dynamic enough and don't truly reflect the real will of the people enough. And one of the reasons for that, I believe, is that many politicians and many political parties become almost, if you like, indebted to the organizations that back them either as individuals or as parties and help them get into power. And you therefore end up with this skewing of what the real agenda of that political party is. Yes, it wants to do the right thing for the people, but within the constraints given to it by the people who are backing it. And so your comments about the Supreme Court, 5 of the 9 is a really high ratio. And it does make you wonder how much influence has Opus Dei had on the political landscape in the US? And of course, given the fact that the US political landscape affects all other landscapes, how much of an influence is it having around the world? But by complete coincidence, and you've really got me buzzing here, Gareth, and now I'm the one going on, not you. My wife and I watched a great film the other week called Conclave. And
Mhm.
fascinating. Have you seen it, Gareth, by any chance?
Yes, I
Yeah.
have absolutely. Yeah.
Brilliant. Brilliant. If I had to summarize that in a couple of sentences, it would be a really interesting film about the tensions between the old and the new within the Catholic Church. Those who wanted and welcomed and embraced change, and those who were actively trying to stop it happening. And it all plays out, as you obviously know, Gareth, in the way that the next pope gets elected, etc. Brilliant film. And that story of the tension between the old and the new has come across in the way you've articulated your book. Um, this is absolutely fascinating. I could go on for ages. But what I've written down is a little phrase. To my mind, what he described as being my phrase, it's about how religion has been weaponized for a political purpose. And that's a fascinating area to take you in because I don't know what the rights and wrongs here are. There's an argument to say religion is politics. If religion isn't about the politics, then what's its purpose? So there's that argument. There's another argument, which is to say that politics should be completely devoid of things which are essentially about an individual's spirituality. Fascinating stuff. I'm going to go to Mr. Eric Smith first because I can always draw on Mr. Eric Smith to come up with some comments and questions. Eric, tell everybody where you are. Spend 20 seconds, no more, telling everybody what you do. That may be of particular interest to a young gentleman from Exeter University who I had the pleasure of speaking with today. So a little bit about yourself, Eric, just the tiniest intro you can, and then share your reflections, please, on what Gareth has been telling us tonight. Thank you.
Well, hi everyone. I am a former estate planning and ERISA attorney in the U.S. in the Detroit area, and I am now an institutional investment consultant and the creator of decision assistance technology that's designed to transfer the balance of power away from Wall Street into the hands of individual investors and trustees. So that's about it in a nutshell. The question that I had, and this is fascinating background. Um, I had seen some information about Opus Dei in the Tom Hanks movies recently, and some of the details of which are confirmed by your slides, which was fascinating. What I'm interested in and what was not in your presentation is exactly the triggering of how the bank collapsed. What were the triggering factors um, in that so that there's some dots that we can connect further?
Sure. I mean,
Great
I mean,
stuff.
it was. I mean, the obviously there was a Spanish real estate boom in the late 2010s, and this bank, having kind of sat out on the first part of the boom, decided to get in too late. They decided that, and so they basically took too many risks. And when the real estate bubble popped around the time of the global financial crisis, Banco Popular had huge problems, and what it did was basically try to cover up its problems and try to deny, and it was hoping that it would basically kind of grow its way out of its problems. That didn't happen. And so then what then happened? The Opus Dei's control over the bank as well made cleaning up the bank that much more difficult because normally what happens when a bank has a huge hole it needs to fill is that it invites new shareholders to come in to pump money into the bank, and the existing shareholders are diluted. They lose the power they have. Opus Dei absolutely did not want that to happen, which was partly why they dragged their feet. So, in part, the collapse of the bank was because of, bad financial decisions that were made, not just at this bank, but at many banks at the time. They fell into this trap of thinking that they could pour huge amounts of money into real estate, lending to developers, and it would all be fine. So that wasn't unique to Banco Popular, but what was unique to Banco Popular was this weird ownership structure, which was, very untransparent. They weren't open about the Opus Dei connection at all. And wanting to maintain that ownership structure and not to be diluted was kind of what left them to drag their feet, and eventually the bank would collapse.
Let me ask one quick follow-up question.
Uh-huh.
In the US, when a bank fails, the bank regulators typically come in on a Friday afternoon, and on Monday, the bank opens under another name with another bank owning it. Um, does anything similar happen in Spain? Um, and and how is the bank and Opus Dei running their finances today post the collapse?
So it's kind of similar. Actually, just before this bank collapsed, the European Union had drawn up a new kind of framework for handling failed banks. Taxpayers were sick of basically bailing out the bankers and the banks. And so the European Union put together this new framework. Banco Popular was the first test of that framework. So what happened was, this bank failed on, I can't remember what day it was, maybe a Tuesday evening. It had been kind of flagged for some time, so a few other banks were sniffing around the edges. What the regulators did was they basically wrote down all of the shareholders down to zero, wrote down a bunch of bondholders, and then they put the rest of the bank out for tender. And the rest of the bank's assets were sold for €1 to Banco Santander, which is one of the largest banks in the world, operates in the US. Now, actually, and they've taken over all the good assets of Popular, and they've made them part of its bank. Now that takeover was what actually made it possible for me to come in and tell the story. As a financial journalist, I had a good relationship with Santander. They respected me as a journalist. So when I came knocking on the door saying, "Hey, that bank you acquired? Well, you also acquired their archives as part of the purchase, and I'm kind of interested in its history. Would you let me come in and look at the archives?" So thanks to the change in ownership, the new bank, they didn't have a hand in any of the scandal that happened before. They had nothing to do with Opus Dei, and so they were very happy for me to come in and sift through the records and piece together the story. So yeah, that's what happened. And your second question about Opus Dei's finances these days, well, the way they operate, it's very much at kind of they operate this enormous network of charities and foundations all around the world, but it's all at an arm's length distance, which gives them deniability, so that whenever any money from one of these foundations is used to do something, you know, slightly controversial or scandalous, or whenever there's any blowback, it gives them this, they can say it's got nothing to do with us. These charities, foundations are completely independent. And it also means that, if there's ever any blowback, if there's ever any claims for compensation, then Opus Dei can say this has got nothing to do with us. But there's a system of control. So, Opus Dei decides which of its members will be fronting these shell companies. It basically decides what's going to happen at board meetings before the board meetings even take place. I've spoken to many people who've sat on these foundations and charities who basically told me, I never made any decisions. I was just told what to sign and when. Um, just to give you an idea
Wow.
as to the size of the network, it's very hard to piece together Opus Dei's network and assets, um, partly because of the way that it operates. But I pinpointed about, I think it was 150 non-profits in the United States alone, with assets of about $1 billion between them, mainly real estate, but also cash and shares and other things. So that's the kind of financial resources that the organization has in the United States alone. And the US is not a particularly big country for Opus Dei. As I said before, there are about 3,000 members. Globally, it has about 100,000 members. Its biggest countries are Spain, Italy, Mexico, Argentina. The US probably ranks about fifth or sixth. So if it has $1 billion of resources at its disposal in the US, you can only imagine, the amount of resources it has on a global level.
Is that a very specific question? I promise we'll go to others in a moment. Is there any evidence of the money being used for political funding or backing politicians and that kind of thing? Have you come across anything that's quite firm in that space, Gary?
So, I mean, in my book, I detail how the Opus Dei foundations have come together to try to shape the political agenda in the US. So the way that they've kind of been pushing concepts like natural law and originalism, how they've been sponsoring various academic postings at places like Princeton and Harvard to
So,
really kind of push forward that agenda and have these people as spokespeople. There was also Opus Dei money involved in. There was a referendum in if referendum is the right word in California on same-sex marriage in the 2010s. No, sorry, in 2008, I think it was 2008, 2009. And there was Opus Dei money that went into ensuring that the right outcome happened there. But in other parts of the world, you know, these foundations, they very much direct their resources at anti-abortion policies and candidates. The One of the presidential candidates in the Peruvian election, which is happening later this year, in a few months, in fact, is an Opus Dei member. The guy that was recently elected in Chile is very closely allied to Opus Dei as well. A number of people on the far right in Europe, especially the Vox Party in Spain, has a number of people that are linked to Opus Dei. So I mean, a lot of this happens kind of below the surface, and I think the best way for me to think about Opus Dei is as a network. So it's a number of people are members, but other people are kind of drawn into into the network as well through the Opus Dei schools network, through the Opus Dei universities. Opus Dei has a very prominent business school called ESE. ESE is actually part of Opus Dei, the Spanish business school, one of the leading business schools in the world. Um, so it's all part, it's a
mm,
way of drawing people into the network, and then, yes, there are all these foundations with money. The money's directed to various political causes. It's directed at advancing the recruitment of Opus Dei around the world, but also, the Opus Dei network operates. People are connected to other people. Business deals are set up so
yeah,
that
yeah.
people are kind of almost indebted to the Opus Dei network, and yeah, and that kind of creates this kind of feedback mechanism as well.
You've described it so clearly. We can all imagine the kind of organization you're talking about. We've got a couple of minutes before we get to 7 o'clock. Let's see if we can squeeze in one or two more questions. Caroline Nickel, you just put something in the chat. Could you articulate your question directly to Gareth, please? So, short question, short answer, Gareth. Thank you.
Yeah, very, very quickly. Wonderful representation. I have ordered the book. Thank you. And I'm curious, what would be your best outcome from having published this book? What would you like to see happen?
The
Great
best
question.
outcome, and I mean, to borrow one of the phrases on your website, sunlight is the best disinfectant, and I think so many people have innocently been drawn into this movement. They've been targeted by Opus Dei and drawn into its clutches. Both adults, elite members, politicians, the rest of it. They've kind of very innocently been drawn into this movement, and many young adults in universities and also children in Opus Dei schools have been targeted. What I hope is that, thanks to getting this information out there, I can arm those people to make the right decision. They can now come into the movement, or make a decision about whether they want to be part of this movement, armed with information about how it really operates and the kind of abuse that it's inflicted upon hundreds, thousands of members over the years, and the way that it controls and manipulates people to further its own ends, the way that it abuses people's interest in their faith and their spirituality as a way of kind of getting into their lives and under their skin and pushing them to do things that they otherwise might not do. So I just hope it sheds a bit of light so that people can make informed decisions about whether or not they want to be part of this group or not.
What about the
Caroline,
contamination of our politics?
Again, I mean, little old me as just one guy, I have very influence over that. All I can hope, and maybe this is naive, but by getting the information out there and getting the data and you know, having followed the money and made the connections and told the story in a way that I hope is engaging and understandable. I think I just hope that people out there will now have their eyes opened to the way that this organization operates. I mean, my deep hope is that, the church does something about this group. That, there is talk that Pope Leo could disband Opus Dei, and we are expecting some kind of announcement. But, call me skeptical, but I think that Leo perhaps doesn't really want to upset things too much. He'll probably kind of make a few reforms around the edges so it looks like he's done something and that he's kind of tackling the more kind of egregious elements of abuse that the organization is part of, but without really kind of getting to the heart of the problem, without really dismantling the network, without really kind of striving for any kinds of justice or compensation for the many victims of this organization.
Caroline, that was a particularly good question you first asked, and a great answer, Gareth. Thank you very much. It's 7 o'clock, so we're not going to hold you for much longer, Gareth, because I know your kids will be saying, "Dad, Dad, where's my tea?" Does anybody have a question or a comment they're itching to make before we bring tonight's very, very, very interesting conversation to a close? Mr. Marcus Greps, I'm so pleased you put your hand up. It gives me yet another chance to say that beautiful name of yours, Marcus
Thank you.
Greps. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Gav, for this very interesting presentation. I'm going to be very quick, which is unusual for me, but I'll put the question in the chat. I was wondering, as part of your investigative work, have you ever experienced any obstructions by Opus Dei members, whether openly or covertly? And if so, what would that have entailed? Hopefully not blackmail or anything like that. But, if someone is poking around, they might actually get onto Gav and silence him, more or less. So be interested to hear. Thank you.
It's interesting because the organization likes to talk about how it's completely transparent, it's open, it has nothing to hide. And so I decided to just go with that. And so I was like, fine, guys, if you have nothing to hide, then surely you don't mind me answering these questions. And to their credit, they lined up a bunch of interviews for me, connected me with a number of the senior members. But at the same time, I always sensed that there was this reluctance to really kind of go into detail on certain things. And I think once they realized the kind of level of granular detail that I'd had and the kind of evidence that I'd accumulated, they began to make things a little bit more difficult. I mean, I think when I started to really ask the more difficult questions about the group's connections to human trafficking rings in South America and Africa, they just completely shut down communication with me. And then in the months before the book came out, having refused to answer, the really serious allegations of the book, the things about, abuse and human trafficking, accusations which, by the way, have been upheld by federal prosecutors in Argentina. So it's not just me saying this. These are serious accusations made by seasoned lawyers in other countries. Um, Instead of answering, having refused to answer my questions in the months before the book came out, they then hammered us with all of these legal threats. They hired one of the most aggressive um, law firms in the US, a firm that was a favorite of Donald Trump whenever he wanted to go after journalists and silence them. And they basically came after us and threatened us. They threatened to bankrupt me and my publisher. And, to their credit, Simon and Schuster stood by me and, they published the book. They didn't bat an eyelid at these threats that were leveled at us. When Opus Dei realized the threats weren't going to work, when they realized the book was going to come out anyway, they then launched this kind of disinformation campaign. So instead of kind of, you know, taking on what the book was saying, instead of answering the questions that were thrown up by the book, they decided to do this kind of switch and bait strategy of, they invented this alternative narrative about me being a complete liar and how I was anti-Catholic and how I was a bigot. It was just, a way of not really answering any of the questions. So, you know, whilst initially they were helpful in a very kind of in a not very thorough way. And then as soon as they sensed that the book, I was maybe onto something, onto issues that they didn't really want to talk about, they shut things down, issued threats, and then, instead of actually kind of answering the questions once the book came out, they've just basically tried to yeah, they've launched this disinformation campaign calling me a liar and the rest of it, which I think tells you all you need to know about just how Christian this organization is.
This has been a really fascinating conversation. Mr. Gareth Gore, before I properly thank you for tonight's session, serious point. We in TTF land have something that we think could be something you may want to write a book about. I do mean that quite literally. So I'll liaise with you about that. So brace yourself for getting your pen out on this one. It would be pretty phenomenal. This has been fascinating. You've taken the conversation, Gareth, into areas we've never really discussed on a TTF event. We've run hundreds and hundreds before. And for me personally, the real takeaway is the question, what can we do to defend the integrity of our democracies better so that our democracies can run clean of inappropriate influences? I'm not talking about religion. I'm talking about agenda-ized religion, which I think is a different thing. I think most of us would agree. Thank you very much indeed. Can we please show our appreciation to Gareth Gore and let him get on to make his kids' tea? Thank you very much indeed, Gareth. That was great.
I just say a number of people have asked how they can stay in touch. I have a Substack which I don't update that regularly. I'm on the awful place X as well and Blue Sky. But look, I mean, given that this is a small group, I've put my email there. So if anyone has any questions or wants to reach out about anything, please feel free. But please don't share my email any more widely. That's just for this kind of small group. But I'd be more than happy to answer any further questions you have, or if you have any suggestions for things I should be looking into, then feel free. I look forward to hearing from you, Andy.
Thank you very much indeed. Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, everybody, wherever you are in the world. Thank you very much, Gareth. That was great. I'll be in touch soon. Cheers. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Take care, guys. Have a nice evening.
Everyone.
Good night all. Thank you. That was super.